Okay, good afternoon to everybody. This is the fourth session of this set of discussions on disinformation. The session today will be devoted to the code of practice and to the accountability of social media and other online platforms in countering the phenomenon. And we'll discuss about the origin, the reasons why this code of practice has been considered as an important step. We'll also discuss about the lesson that can be drawn from the first year of implementation of the code. And we will also embark at the end on a hopefully interesting discussion regarding possible step forwards. This discussion will be moderated by me. I am Paolo Cesarini, the head of the unit responsible for this file in DG Connect, and I have the pleasure to moderate a panel of distinguished speakers, and starting from the left side of the panel, Cornelia Cutler. You are, Cornelia, the Senior Director and responsible for EU government affairs in Microsoft. I understand that you are particularly responsible for AI, privacy, regulatory policies in the EU, and with a focus on digital transformation and ethical implications. So your team is very much involved in the regulatory affairs. That includes competition, privacy, but also content, right? Next to you, Lubos Kuklis. Lubos is the executive director at the Council for Broadcasting and Retransmission of Slovakia, which is the audiovisual regulator in Slovakia. Currently, Lubos also holds the chair of the European Group of Audiovisual Regulators, the ERGA, and has been particularly involved in the monitoring of the code of practice during the last months within ERGA's task force. And next to you, Milan Zubiec, you are responsible for governmental affairs and public policy manager. I think that is the correct definition in Google. And Milan has also been intensively involved during the whole monitoring phase of the code of practice, in particular during the election period and thereafter. Beside you, Anya Helset is an old friend and very much present since the very beginning of the discussion around disinformation, as responsible for content policies in Facebook. And last but not least, Gianni Riotta is a very well-known journalist in Italy, has been working for several newspapers, La Stampa, Corriere della Sera, Sole 24 Ore, has also been the director of in Rai for TG1. And now he teaches in Pittsburgh, and he's dean of the School of Journalism in Lewis University in Rome. Gianni was also a member of the high-level group on disinformation in the last year, and I'm sure he can provide a quite interesting point of view from an external observer about the code and its implications. Well, I would like to simply say a few words to introduce the topic for those who have not been following the previous session of this topic that the Connected University has organized and we continue to organize over the next months. The code of practice is the result of a quite intense work across different stakeholders. In fact, the first idea of a self-regulatory approach came out from the reports that the high-level group on disinformation published in March the last year. And it has been picked up in the communication that the Commission adopted in April the last year. And immediately after the adoption of the communication, DigiConnect organized a multi-stakeholder forum representing the online platforms, representing as well the sector of the advertising industry, grouped in a working group with a task of elaborating principles and rules for engagement by the industry concerned on a self-voluntary code, and accompanied by a critical review by a sounding board, which was flanking the working group in the context of the multi-stakeholder forum. And the task of the sounding board was to stimulate and to push the frontier a bit further, of course, the sounding board being represented by professionals from the media sector, both the print press and the broadcasting sector, as well as the academic sector and the civil society. The result of this endeavor has been the code of practice that we will discuss today, which has been in force since the mid-October of the last year, following the signature by Facebook, Google, Twitter, Mozilla, and a number of associations that represent the ecosystem and the advertising sector. Microsoft has joined the club, if I can say so, only at the later stage, but brought an important contribution for the development of the policies under the code. It's important to stress that the code is not a text that has been written by the Commission, but it is a text that has been written by the industry directly concerned. The Commission has acted as a facilitator and now is acting together with the audiovisual authorities of the member states as an authority that monitors the implementation of the code and establish whether or not the purported objectives that have underlined its conception have actually been achieved, or the extent to which these objectives have been achieved. This is where we stand today. The latest step in this laborious and very intense process have included an intermediate phase of monitoring based on monthly reports provided by the signatories of the code in the run-up to the European elections. So in practice, since January of this year up to May, when the elections at the European Parliament took place, the signatories were required to present a progress report on a monthly basis showing the action and the effect of the action they have undertaken in order to ensure the integrity of the electoral processes, of this particular electoral process. The focus was on in particular on three aspects. One was the policies designed to better scrutinize ad placements to avoid that advertising revenues would flow towards websites or other media that were behaving in an unfair or untrustworthy manner in the information space online, media that were actually misrepresenting their own identity or having recourse to techniques that were deliberately misleading the readers, including the use of sensationalist content that we know has the potential to attract viewers and therefore to raise revenues through the advertising clicks. So this clickbaiting practice. The second aspect that has been very much under monitoring up to the election was the political advertising, the transparency of political advertising, and the system put in place in order to ensure a public disclosure of political advertising and searchability of these ads by journalists and by the research community as well. The third aspect was about acting against various forms of manipulation of this digital media, in particular social media, by actors that would create fake accounts or use automatic systems like bots in order to amplify the reach of their own messages, and therefore misleading the readers as regards the popularity of the stories promoted by these actors, and with the aim, of course, to skewing public opinion and kind of changing their voting decision in a quite sophisticated social engineering type of approach. After that, the work has not stopped, and the latest step has been the publication of the self-assessment presented by all the signatories on the 26th October, I think, of this year, where they draw a kind of state of play for in 12 months of implementation, covering all the various aspects of the code, which I recall also include, in addition to the 3 points I've just mentioned, also the development of tools to empower users, tools that can consist in making authoritative and authentic content more visible, more prominent on the respective services. Also tools to enable users to flag inappropriate content to the platforms, tools that enable to give to users to have more context around the news that they get through these services. In addition, the other part was of the code, the final part of the code was about empowering the research community, and therefore to establish a system of access to platforms data for research purposes. The self-assessment takes a snapshot of the situation at the end of October of this year, and it's now the ball is in our camp and also in the camp of the audiovisual regulators to determine what is the what the next step could or should be in order to maintain the necessary oversight over a phenomenon that everybody understands is particularly damaging for our democracy and risks to become more and more impactful as the techniques used to manipulate content have the ability to be, particularly difficult to detect in the future. There were deepfakes or other forms of AI-generated text combined with other techniques of micro-targeting could really make a difference in the way that people form their opinions about political or social issues. Now, that is the context. That is the kind of background for this conversation today. And I would like to start by asking the members of this panel to give us, first of all, to start with their own impressions about whether or not the decision that was taken 1 year ago to opt for a self-regulatory approach as a first step was a necessary, a good step, and what it is their experience in that respect. I would follow the same order without dividing the panelists into class industry regulators and journalists, but simply following the flow that the initial presentation has been followed. So Cornelia, the floor is yours.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. And so the latecomer to the code of practice is starting, and maybe I can start with an explanation why we were late. And an overall impression, those two parts. So first, why we were late, because Microsoft is not at the center of the disinformation debate. It is not on our services as prevalent as it is on others. The reason for that is that we don't have general purpose social media in our portfolio of services. So we do have the real identity social media, LinkedIn, that has a different tailored audience and the efforts that LinkedIn takes in order to keep that tailored audience in a trusted environment are very, very different. The incentives, the business model are also very, very different. Generally, and not in relation to the code of practice specifically. When we were looking at what's happening on the market, we felt that there is a need to focus our cybersecurity efforts also on misinformation and defending democracy. So we started a new team with the name Defending Democracy to engage on a number of efforts in this space. And at the beginning, we didn't feel that the code of practice is something that we should be part of. In hindsight, once that we have signed, we would have liked to actually be part of the drafting effort, because of course, once you're in the drafting driver's seat, you can also manage better how a specific code of conduct actually relates to the own services. And that is certainly something that we felt bitterly when reporting on our commitments, because they were not specifically drafted according to our services. Now, generally speaking, and this is not the first code of conduct that I have lived with in the commission. There has been many also in DG Connect over the last 10 years that I've been, or 11 years by now, that I've been working with Microsoft, and even before. This is always a good first step in learning about the issues, the problems, what needs to be tackled. We are in a world where technology has a tremendous pace. And so you can't always directly legislate. From a legal regulatory perspective, as I look often at things, co-regulation or self-regulation is always a necessary step to really start understanding the issues at hand and as they evolve. There might be legislation coming. We can talk about this a little bit later or not, but I think this is, in any event, a first step in getting industry regulators and civil society together and define the problem and start finding solutions together. So,
very good. Lubos, what's your perspective in this?
Thank you. Well, we were a bit surprised when we were entered in the action plan to fight disinformation, because we weren't informed beforehand. So for us, it was something a bit striking. But the thing is that indeed, when you are thinking about regulatory authorities or about regulators in the EU who are close to this topic, probably it would be media authorities. Although we have to say that at the time that the action plan was rolled out and the code of practice was announced and signed, there were no regulatory authorities in the Europe that had like real competence over disinformation or the online environment as such, for that matter. So for us, it was we were very interested in cooperating with the Commission and that, but of course it was something like a hard thing to do and think about. But then, of course, we said, who else is going to do it? So we will jump in. And we looked at the code of practice, and the first thing that strikes you really is that when you have to measure something, whether something is working, you need something measurable there. The thing was that there is not much measurable in the code of practice. So this is something that you, and I think, the critique was there also from the sounding board and from the others. But indeed, if you are called upon to be the one who will be monitoring how this is implemented, you would like to have something tangible on the paper. But indeed, then you need to work somehow around that. And so we did. We sat down with Paolo and his team, of course, and looked at what we can actually do. We used the timing of the whole code of practice was vis-a-vis the EU elections, and of course it helped also us as regulators, because then all the regulators had the same elections to work with. So we used, I think, 16 member states. I think in 16 member states we did although it varies a bit, but in 13 we can say that we did the monitoring of the whole of the EU elections, which is quite a good number when you think about it, because you can't do, not every regulatory authority have the same capacities and same resources, but we used the 13 examples and we rolled it out and did the monitoring. Now the third thing you need for that kind of exercise is data, because in order to really see what we did as outside users of the platforms is we were trying to observe how many of the political advertising, for example, you can see the instances of things that when the platforms rolled out the ad archives. So we're looking at the ad archives and at what we can observe as users on the ground, so to say. But just this is only a very small portion of what's happening in the environment, right? So to have more data about that is something that you actually need to do the monitoring properly. We couldn't have them. There was an intense debate at that time. We understood that just during the elections, the ad archives were improved. So we've seen like real time how the ads were added to the archives. But we of course have been able to observe some false negatives. So you can see and at political advertising as a user, but it's not included, for example, in the archive. So there's something that you mark down, and this is the actual monitoring that we did. But of course, the shortcomings were around the data and around the fact that although the archives should have been rolled out before the elections, actually it was happening during the elections. But so to see what what's happening there and how to monitor this was a great experience for us. It was a new one, but it was a great experience because then you can see, okay, for the next time, and we have many elections around Europe and every year, is okay, we will need this, and this. So write it down, and then we can ask for that later on. But just that we got the opportunity to look at this, and that we use the call of the Commission as a sort of competence to look at this, was something really helpful, I think, not only for us as media authorities, but also for the member states and for the people who are thinking about these things in the member states. So then in Slovakia, where I come from, we used that experience a lot about discussions with the people from our government, that we now know, okay, if we're going to be useful in this area, we need certain kind of competencies. And again, the good thing is that, for example, we are now implementing the Audiovisual Media Services Directive. The transposition is currently ongoing. So it is a good time, really, if you now know what you need to ask for. You can say to your government, okay, if you want us to have this competence, we actually need, research capacities, for example. Or another thing that is extremely important is media literacy kind of right for the authorities, because this is very much connected to the problem of disinformation and the code of practice, because there's one pillar that is dedicated to media literacy. But it's also it's not the case in every member state that media authorities actually are the ones who are coordinating the work on media literacy. And just to avoid the problem of disinformation, because not everybody is there are governments, so for example, or politicians that wouldn't want to fight disinformation, either because they very strongly believe in freedom of speech and think that it might hinder freedom of speech, or there are some that find it actually useful that we have this kind of environment. So probably, just to call something disinformation and talk only about disinformation might not be that useful. But to understand the environment, which is the crucial thing, the first step to fight disinformation, for that you need a lot of research capacity. So this is the thing that we need to think about now, and the media literacy, as I said. So I think code of practice helped us in that direction, and allowed us to see what even those tools that are rolling out by the platforms now are useful, actually are very useful. But then you also see the shortcomings, and we have to spell it out, I think, very vocally. And this is the lack of data. So I think we will be talking about what to do next, but I think, I can already pinpoint one direction, and this is transparency.
Thank you, Lukasz. So I understand your message as being a necessary good step, but as all self-regulatory instruments, they need to have built into them some kind of measurements in order to establish what the next step, so how to continue further with the implementation of these good policies and these good practices. In your case in particular, the fact that in a quite surreptitious way, I would say, the action plan has created or hinted about new competences for ERGA authorities has been a challenge, and that I understand, but also an opportunity, because indeed the scope for the activities of audiovisual authorities, even if the IVMSD has enlarged to audiovisual platforms to some extent, still remain truncated. If you look at what the information space is about after the digital transformation that involves many other actors that probably should fall within the competence of the ERGA regulators. So that I think it's an important message. And now turning to Milan. So you have been very much involved since the beginning, including the drafting of the code of practice. What is your view about the importance of a self-regulatory approach in this particular space, where, in fact, it is not about blocking or taking down illegal content as it's been done in other areas like hate speech or incitement to violence, terrorism, but where we have a very thin line not to be overstepped, which is the line of freedom of expression, freedom of opinion, and how Google has been tackling this particular challenge within the code of practice.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation by the organizers of Connect University, and thank you, Paolo, not just for moderating this discussion, but also for continuously driving the process forward. And you said that you were mere conveners as your team in terms of the code, but I think that's one of the most important learnings for us and for all the participants, is this continuous exchange of ideas, continuous improvements in terms of reporting, in terms of improving our policies. To your question about how we look at the code 1 year since its signature, I would say that we are still very, very proud of the progress that has been made. This is globally the first, and I would still say, in terms of the scope, still the only code of such kind globally, and it really has a global impact. I think that overall you see that governments in other regions are often looking to Europe and what is happening in Europe, and for this code and for the work on disinformation, this is particularly true. And you can also see that some of the learnings that we've made throughout the process, we also implement globally, and we'll be talking about the political ads, and some of our latest announcements are very much global announcements are very much aligned with what we started doing in Europe, because we understand that it works. We see the impact, and we have this sort of exchange of ideas. If you look at all the 5 pillars that the code covers, I think that we've made progress in all of them, be it ad scrutiny, be it transparency of political ads, integrity of services, cooperation with fact checkers and researchers, be it the media literacy. I think that there has been a lot of progress in terms of policy changes, in terms of improvements, and most importantly in terms of reporting. The open channels of communication between all the different stakeholders, and I think this is the important part of the code. There is a multi-stakeholder platform where really the regulators are meeting with the platforms. We have the sounding board, so we have some immediate reactions. It's all public, so everything is done in a real time, and everything we publish goes out, and that's an important learning for us. These improvements are, I would say, very tangible, and the immediate feedback is something that helps us move on. Very, very often, we've been asked to report on areas that we ourselves wouldn't even think about. And throughout the monthly reports, you could see that I would say all the signatories expanded the scope of reported areas month by month. Now, if you compare the baseline report of 2018 and the annual self-assessment, you would see many different areas that are now covered that have not been covered before. Is this ideal, or is this the end? This is the end line? Of course not. This is a process. This is a learning process, I think, for all of us, and it's quite sometimes surprising that it is only 1 year since we've signed the code, and I think all of us who have been working this would say that it has been already much longer. But it also shows the extent of work that is still in front of us. And now, when we are looking at the annual assessment, I would argue that there are two parts of what we need to look into. First, have we really done our homework, and have all the platforms really done what they committed to? And the second thing, and we will get to that, is this enough? Is this sufficient? And what we can do more in this area. One positive, maybe final remark here. One sort of positive result is, and Cornelia touched upon it, is the clarification, is the evidence making. Every good policy needs to be evidence based, and for us, being part of this self-regulatory or co-regulatory approach is a good opportunity to provide the evidence, so that when we move ahead and might decide that some areas require further looking into beyond the self-regulation, there is already some evidence and there is better understanding for all the different stakeholders that have been involved. And this is I think really important part of this, not just on the EU level, but also on the level of the member state. And all the learnings that we've made throughout the process leading up to the May 2019 elections, it's all in there, it all stays, and it all stays for all the future elections in the member states. And this is one of the further improvements that I see.
Very good. And I think, Anya, it is the mirror image of Google, but with the Facebook perspective. What's your point of view there?
Thank you, Paolo. Yes, indeed, we probably will have quite similar observations on that. We also, as Facebook, joined from the very beginning the work on the code, the drafting, and we were very from the beginning committed to the whole process. And for the company, of course, this is one of the biggest priority: how we can tackle this phenomena using this multifaceted approach. By showcasing various policy changes and product changes that we are constantly undertaking. We are definitely in a very different place as a company that we were, for instance, 2 years ago, around time of the US elections. We are also in a very different place even that we were 1 year ago. I mean, already during the process of reporting to the code, we rolled out various policy changes that included, for example, how we deal with vaccination misinformation. We rolled out certain video labels trying to proactively inform our users about certain political information they're seeing there. Our fact-checking program increased from 7 fact-checkers at the start of the process, and right now we have 20 fact-checkers in Europe. The code was absolutely instrumental in helping us to build that policy. And of course, this is similar to Google. This is a global policy, so it wasn't just focused only on Europe. These are global changes, global commitments that we have undertaken, and we will continue doing so continuously through next years, and definitely there is more announcement that you will be seeing next year, for example. So indeed, this is the start. Code, of course, was very helpful in a sense that it helped us to structure our progress. The way we were feedbacking to the European Commission, I think, also was helpful to a broader audience to kind of in one place find all the relevant updates, and definitely the overall report, which underlines progress made from the beginning till basically the elections to the European Parliament, is an interesting kind of roadmap of various policy tools that are now available here in Europe and also globally. So I do think it was definitely very important exercise. Indeed, it feels like it was maybe longer than 1 year, but I think it just shows how many changes we did in the past months. This is never going to be enough. We don't have the solution in a sense that even technology, people, and all this combined can never fix the whole misinformation problem on the platform. But that doesn't mean that we will stop our efforts. This is an arms race, as we often were saying. We see it also as a necessary effort to engage with the education side of this process, with media literacy initiatives, working with journalists, working with educators, so that we can basically amplify whatever we do and make sure that even if something gets through the system, so to say, we are all equipped with skills to distinguish this kind of types of content that are aiming to bring us some kind of misinformation. So I will stop here and serve the rest for next question.
Thank you, Ania. And now coming to you, Gianni. Well, you have been in the high-level group. And the high-level group, there were a lot of discussion about what approach to follow, whether hard regulation, where regulating through the market, enforcement of market rules, or going a chance for a self-regulatory approach. Now, 1 year more has passed. Would you go back? In case you would rewind the time, you go back to the high-level group, would you change your mind?
It's interesting, Paolo. First of all, thanks to you for the invitation and Connect University, because for you guys, the high-level group is over, but for us that we're inside, it's not over, because there are chats, there are WhatsApp groups, there are people that send you 25 mails a day saying, well, you actually in session 2 said this. Look what Facebook is doing today. Look what Google is doing today. It's like, what did I say? I actually landed, arrived. It's a conversation that's going on, still going on, still pretty much alive. And in my double life, half in the United States and half in Europe, Rome, Brussels, Paris, Pittsburgh, by the way, it would be too cold for me. It's Princeton that I teach. No, because Pittsburgh, for a Sicilian born like me, is way too cold. It's very interesting, because it's very interesting how the understanding on the platform, of the judgment on the platform, changes if you are in Rome, Paris, or Washington, New York. And it's very interesting that Europe and the European Union is now recognized as the leader of cyber rights, of the fight against disinformation, on the fight for privacy. This is something that people that like the European Union, or people that dislike the European Union, acknowledge. If you look at the American election 2020 and the Democratic primaries this year, it is clearly acknowledged by people that say, we shouldn't do like the Europeans. We shouldn't have like laws for to regulate the platform, or to protect privacy, or to fight disinformation, because we are Americans. Or the other side says, since we are Americans, we should do more than the Europeans are doing, fighting for privacy, fighting against disinformation. But the interesting thing for us Europeans is that we are setting the tone of the conversation. And this is, I mean, you guys that work in the multinational platform know that when you agree or when you disagree, this is pretty much the philosophical win. So I think that we were successful, Paolo, because we set the tone of the conversation. You guys set the tone of the conversation. I was sometimes skeptical, sometimes more convinced. So that's good. We can chalk this. There are a lot of cons. Disinformation is now more powerful, more dangerous than was in 2016. Is hitting in the European election, was hitting the European election last year, is hitting in the British election this year, the American election, is very active in Italy, is very active on health and on racism issues, plenty of different issues. So we still have a lot of work to do. What I can say where the code is working and where the code is not working. The code is working to me because it is a benchmark for the platforms, and whether they skirt it or whether they implement it, at least they have a benchmark, while in the United States right now, they don't have this kind of benchmark. So the debate is all on the guys. And it's interesting when you talk behind the scenes to people working at Facebook, at Google. I'm not familiar with Microsoft, but I'm positive that it's the same at Microsoft too. The debate that is inside the platform with people taking off, often, Paolo, when they have private meetings, the debate is very active in Facebook, in Google, in Twitter, because of course there are different views, there are different points of view. So, and this is another point that is positive because there is a debate within the platform. What is not working? Access to data is still very hard. It's still very hard. I work with the Aletheia Center at Luis University in Rome, and we are part of the SOMA project on disinformation Horizon 2020 with other friends with Luis University. We are trying to get access, for example, to data on Facebook on vaccination. It is almost never a no. It's almost never a no. But it's like when you want to date a girl that never says no, but he never says yes. I mean, you never get that Saturday afternoon date in high school, and you keep saying, trying. We keep asking, but there should be, as you were saying, more on transparency and on access data on platform. Well, last point, Paolo. If we meet again late, 1 year from now, December 2020, the situation may be radically different because while the pressure now is from the European Union on the platforms with the code, next year, should a candidate like Elizabeth Warren win, the pressure could be more on the American side, and we should follow course. So it's a very changing political landscape and very interesting. And for sure, we open the conversation and then we'll see what happens.
Very interesting. We have already been you have already been touching upon certain aspects of the lesson learned in your comments. I think it's a good thing, however, to be a bit more analytic about what we mean about pros, cons of this approach when it comes to the different aspects. I can say a few words about what our impressions is, and I would say afterwards, perhaps Lubos, you can add what your impression are, being as two policymakers, regulators, and in this case we have a kind of a role to send the ball back on their camp in order to get the maximum that we can, which can be reasonably asked for. And then I would like to see how, from their own experience, the signatories of the code, so Microsoft, Facebook, Google, interpret these positions. And for the second round, I would ask you then afterwards, Gianni, to give a bit your view about the exchange, And so from my side, if you look at the code a bit more in detail, the first point was demonetization of bad actors. Well, that implies a scrutiny of ad placement. They look at ads themselves, ads that are misrepresentative, ads that leads into places where, in fact, the user find other ads and not much content. but also ads that are placed on websites that users access via organic content, for instance, so that leads towards websites that use disinformation as a way to keep and retain the attention of the users, in the hope that the various ads that pops up in these pages are clicked on and generate money. This technique was used, for instance, by the kids in Macedonia and Vele, that used the story of the famous story of the Pope supporting Trump in the election as a means to attract the attention, but then in reality that these people were there to make money, not politics. They didn't have a particular political agenda. This is in this context, I might say, there is a difficulty there, because the online digital ecosystem is complicated. There are integrated actors, vertically integrated actors like Google and Facebook, and there are others actors that operate supply side platforms, demand side platforms, ad exchange, ad networks, trading desks, you name it. And this galaxy of actors, it is operating through systems which do not always safeguard, I think, what should be a right for the advertisers to know where their ads are going to land and to enable the advertisers to decide what are the landing pages which are not suitable for their own brand reputation. That system is still very much rusty. I mean, it's very, very oiled when it comes to monetization, but it's very rusty when it comes to providing the necessary brand safety tools for advertisers. That it is the impression that we have had on this point is that the reporting that have been given, particularly by Google, which has in fact broken down by member states, etc. It is an interesting step forward, but at the same time, we don't know very much yet what it is the impact in terms of monetization of the actors that should be in the primary target of these actions, right? How much the flows of money have been diverted as a result of the application of these policies. That we still don't know. The second point is about political advertising. I think it's the place where most progress has been made, and the progress always entails a new demand for better solutions, always. So we had publicly accessible libraries. We have an indication of the criteria that have been used in order to target the sponsored content for political ads. There are still, however, and I think we all know it, about gaps in the system. Political ads are advertisements that are promoted by candidate to elections, or by political groups, or by foundations, or by members of the campaigns. But we know that if you want to artificially shape public opinion, you can use all sorts of issue-based promotional materials, promoted materials on various areas of social importance, and the promotion is not necessarily being attributable to political candidates or to political groups or to foundations. Can be anyone. So there is a big hole in the net when it comes to understanding and acting against forms of micro-targeting that use sponsored content for specific information campaigns. So, and that raised a number of issues. Should micro-targeting, which is the normal bread and butter for the classic commercial advertising business, should that type of approach is legitimate to use the same type of approach when it comes to promoting ideas, promoting opinions, promoting issue-based content? And the other thing is how your systems can be checked against the quality requirements. I mean, are your libraries really complete? How can researchers assess the completeness of these libraries? are all you working with the same definitions? Why there are some attempts by Facebook to cover broader territory than purely political ads by venturing into scrutiny and transparency for issue-based ads, whereas other signatories find the thing extremely challenging. If not, they're still reflecting but not still providing solutions for that. So that it is, in my view, the main question that arises. And micro-targeting, by the way, it is becoming quite prominent in the agenda on a more international basis. If you talk to the Canadians, you talk to the US colleagues, for them, the question about the legitimate use of micro-targeting criteria, it is becoming an issue in itself, beyond the issue of transparency, whether that could be or should be allowed or not. The third aspect is about social engineering, astroturfing, in coordinated behavior, the manipulation of the media through various systems and techniques. That, I think, the reports have opened up a world for us. We didn't know before that policies were set out and the reporting system based on these policies were not made. So thank you for having opened up a world to us, which a world where probably only intelligence services in the member states were aware of so far. And it's important that this awareness goes beyond the closed doors of this particular type of authorities. And hence the importance for audiovisual authorities as well to better understand how media manipulation what type of shape can take media manipulation in this new space, which is a very much evolutive as the technologies evolve. There we were very, very attentive to your reports, at the same time very hungry for knowing better and more. What these fake accounts have been sharing as content. Who were the targets of coordinated groups that operating in Iran, however, they were targeting populations in the EU? Why that? I mean, what is behind? This contextual information is cruelly missing for the time being. But of course, it would be extremely useful to better understand the phenomenon and the development of this phenomenon. So for me, the lesson learned there, it is about how to better gain insights, in-depth insight about the media manipulation that, I repeat, it is an evolving challenge. By the way, the code perhaps is not even complete because there is a flourishing black market of likes, of followers, of viewers, of comments that can be used to boost the popularity of the content and therefore to enable that content to be better ranked, in various services. There is an aspect we have not been discussed in detail about it. So there are also gaps in the approach. Then when you look at the consumer empowerment, which is about, making consumer more active, to have a more proactive, more active role when it comes to flagging content that it is perhaps false, perhaps misleading, and the risk also to create a gateway for bad users to flood you with, to clog the system basically with false claims. So there's a lot of issues there that needs to be considered. There is also the other question about how to better, to have a better balance in the way the algorithms are working in ranking and prioritizing content, which remains, I understand, an ongoing commitment and work in progress to a certain extent. At the same time, we would like to understand with figures, how much disinformation is out there, how much our traditional and authoritative outlets have been gaining in terms of visibility. Are there measurements? And there are measurements. I've seen a couple of days ago, YouTube publishing certain statistics about 50% increase in visibility of authoritative content. But that would be an extremely important indication if only was verifiable and based on, again, verifiable data sets. And here is the final question, is about the data sets, about the cooperation with the community. I think the attempts made so far by creating clusters of researchers at that have been chosen, in case Facebook, for instance, on the basis of traditions or personal relations or knowledge of specific research institute, particularly in the United States, the social science ones experience. It is an opening, but of course leave us as European a little bit in a situation where we are still wondering, what about a truly independent group of researchers that organize themselves in Europe to detect phenomena that affects European users and that have a arm-length relationship with the platforms without being the person chosen by the platform to do this work. So that is another set of questions that I don't want to insist on the importance of data because both Lubos and you, Gianni, have insisted on it. So, but that is the fifth point that it seems to me at the core of the lessons learned. Let aside the fact that you are a bit pioneers, and we appreciate your endeavor within the code of practice, but we also know that the code of practice is voluntary, doesn't commit other actors. And the risk that the risk of migration from your services, from other services which do not apply the same policies elsewhere, it is very high, particularly for certain type of users. For instance, the young people could migrate to Snapchat or to or TikTok and use less Facebook. For bad actors could use less Facebook, but rather these platforms that are outside the scope of the code for targeting young people and so on and so forth. So that is my take. I don't know what's your take, Lubos.
Well, you covered it pretty much, but no, indeed, transparency is the overall assessment of the whole thing, that we need more transparency. But indeed, if you are more analytical, I can probably give you an examples what we actually would need to assess the whole thing. And for the monetization, you said it pretty well, and I think I can't add anything to it. But when it goes to the archives, for example, and the political advertising that is there, what we would actually need to see whether those are complete archives, that indeed those are the political advertising that been available to the users in the member countries. We would need the normal advertising, for I don't know, period of time, 2 days, for example, all the advertising that's been circulating for 2 days, and from that, what the platforms think is the political advertising, and just to compare that, and then go through, I don't know, by some random checks, whether that is actually right, whether there is something that has fallen out of their definition, for example. And we've been specifically asking, of course, during the monitoring phase, we've been specifically asking when we thought that the answer was that probably we are asking wrong questions. We asked, what is the right question to ask? And so we really tried, but of course we understand that there's mainly, the concerns are about the size of the data set, because it is an enormous chunk of data that we were asking for. But indeed, without having that insight, you just can't actually see and understand whether the archives are actually complete. Then the other thing, and it goes specifically, for example, for the integrity of the services, which is the pillar 3, which goes about the bots and the fake accounts that the platforms are taking down, because not only because of the code of practice, but we can see only aggregated data. The number that we can observe is, I don't know, there's been 1 million fake accounts taken down in 1 month. The thing is that, okay, but if you don't know, or other profiles, or there are many other things, but the thing is that, okay, if we don't understand why the action was taken, what was actually wrong with the account that was taken down, for example, what are the numbers for different member states? During the EU elections, okay, this was EU-wide thing, but otherwise politics in Europe is pretty wide driven by what is actually happening in the member states. So if you can't see the data for that particular member state, you really can't understand the context. So this is something that we really would need, those data that we are given broken into actual member states. And this is, again, we understand that probably it is hard in the current situation, but I think this is something that is actually needed. So we would need probably ask the platforms to develop the possibility to do that. And then if you go to the media literacy. There's actually there are things going on. I think it's good that we were really able to observe that many initiatives were done by the platforms, and we are already writing that into the report, so it's positive. But when you are thinking about their cooperation with partners, trusted partners, or the fact-checking organizations. Again, it is good that now it's 2021, for example, those partners for Facebook, but they're not in every member state, for example. And you can't precisely understand how the connection really works. And this goes probably for the whole of the code of practice, as everybody is doing it differently. It is hard to compare what everybody is doing. I know that the Facebook is having contracting partners, that they have a real contract with each other. Twitter and Google are not doing that, for example. So those relations are quite different. So to understand how this is working, and again the transparency of what is the communication back and forth is really needed. And there are those details. For example, we understand that Facebook is working with the fact checkers on through the dashboard. If somebody is flagging that some story is fake, it will go to the dashboard, and then the fact checkers are taking those things, the items from that, and are checking them. Now, as we understood, they are paid by the article debunked, so to say, or the item debunked. Now, we're like asking ourselves, okay, isn't there a danger that they would take the obvious things, which are easy to debunk, just in order to fulfill the quota and everything, and because those fact checkers, there are not that many of them, so you can see that they are flooded with those kind of things. So just to use their capacities more efficiently, there may be an incentive to use those easy ones. So this is something that we are not saying that this is exactly the case, but at least without any further information, we see that potential is there. And when it comes to researchers, of course, you already covered Social Science 1, and we are hearing this from all of the EU, and we actually sat down with the researchers and talked to them, and what's your relationship with the platforms? And the answers are really bad. They're not happy at all with what is happening. You can hear from researchers that are not associated with Social Science 1. They are saying, okay, those high-profile researchers in the Social Science 1, they have things, but we have nothing. And then we are meeting with Social Science 1, and they're saying, we are just researchers and we are not getting enough information and everything. So really, there is probably no researcher that we met with that would say, well, it's working. No, it's like the answers are very negative in this regard. So, and we understand again the platforms. The answer usually is, and we will hear it from our colleagues directly, but it's mainly about GDPR, for example, for the access of the researchers. But again, we double checked. So when we got the answer about GDPR, we went to the authorities around GDPR and asked, could this be a problem with GDPR? And usually it was no, we can't see any problem with GDPR there. So these are the problems that if I don't even think that just under the umbrella of self-regulation, you can actually deal with this complex of the problems. And you definitely can't do that when you are thinking about, okay, these are the platforms that probably are taking this seriously, but there are others who just for the lack of capacity, resources, or just not believing in such a thing wouldn't do anything unless there is something binding also for them. So, and with self-regulation, you just can't bind somebody who is not willing to cooperate. So this is probably the outcome that already is showing some way forward. And just the last thing about this, of course, the code of practice is looking at part of the disinformation problem. There is a very interesting study from Oxford, I don't know, 2 or 3 months old. They're saying, okay, if you are focusing on political advertising, and if we are focusing on the targeted advertising and micro-targeting, that's interesting enough, but it's just a very small part of the disinformation problem, because the real problem is the virality of the information. and the frictionless character of the entire environment. So, and the code of practice is not doing much around that area, but this is something that just, it's the nature of the platforms, and if the sheer nature of the platforms is allowing this to happen, then we have a wider problem. And but everybody feels that this is the problem, but nobody can say for sure because nobody can see the data.
Good. So some food for thought for yourself, and also the floor is for you. I don't know who wants to start. I think Cornelia.
I can say a couple of words, and it's probably easier for me because much of these points don't relate directly to us. I want to make a couple of points, responding a little first what you were saying. Yes, these discussions are very active within companies. There's different views. There is a lot of employee activism as well. They want to do the right thing. I have been working on content regulation type of issues since I started with Microsoft, and there is a tremendous shift in the mindset, certainly also of my US colleagues. 10 years ago, that was all looked at from the lenses of freedom of expression only, or freedom of speech, I should say. I think this has changed. The latest real big thing was the Christchurch event, and that goes a little bit to the virality of content and how it is circulated and the damage it can do. It's not specifically related to misinformation, but it's sort of the same problem. In this context, companies have acted immediately with a protocol. The protocol in that case was first now used in real time with the attacks in Germany against the Jewish church, synagogue, sorry. And so there can be things done, but I also want to say a couple of words on the tensions here. Fact checking is always after the fact checking, and so you can't actually do anything when you fact check in this context with the virality, nor with the micro-targeting. I think those two problems we will not solve with fact checking, and we just need to be clear, and we need to have a more fundamental conversation around when companies that are private have where public interest issues become so pervasive that there needs to be restrictions, and I think and I mean this in the highest level possible, and then go down and look at the details. And I think this is a conversation in particular in the context of online services. It's not dogmatically done. There's too much discussion around platforms too generally. We're not looking enough in the purpose of specific platforms. So the business model behind the specific platforms, all this plays a role in how problems surface and what type of problems surface on those platforms. So I think these are all debates. They're very closely linked. And then of course, and I can see this within Microsoft, certainly, there are multiple issues coming together. We talked about cyber. This misinformation is not only about fraudulent websites that want to make money, but it's about foreign actors trying to influence democratic status. So there's a multiple complex issues, and that's another problem. Yeah, and then on the smaller versus the bigger platforms, I think we need to also understand, and this is a question I asked this morning because your colleagues from DG DevCo had a conference on AI and democratic development, and misinformation came up a lot in this context. And I asked, what are the indicators, and that is, I haven't heard in this debate, what are the indicators when misinformation is actually has an impact? And we clearly have seen Cambridge Analytica having an impact. We have seen the micro-targeting in the US probably having an impact. Brexit, I think we have also seen had an impact. So, but where exactly is it? What are the indicators that define that impact? And again, that will help then also define what type of legislation is needed, or if legislation is needed. And last point I want to say in the context of EU law, it's of course a very problematic and fine line between the competences of national member states and EU law in the context of election. Is it a discussion where we have to think about regulating the advertising market? Is it the election or the surroundings of elections that we need to regulate? All of that we need to start having a clearer discussion around.
Okay, Milan, what's your view?
Thank you. Quite a few topics to cover. Well, first of all, and one thing, I think a general observation from this 1 year of cooperation on the code of practice, and something that I think we've all seen where the challenge is that disinformation is a moving target, and we are in an environment that is changing every day. And even if you look at what has been sort of approved and drafted in the code, and how different people and different institutions and stakeholders see what this actually means, is also a moving target. We've had many discussions about how to sort of translate the qualitative measurements into quantitative data or quantitative measurements overall. So this is something that we've seen as a fairly challenging topic, and I think some of these examples touch upon now really go back to this. On the transparency and the data access, I absolutely understand all the concerns and the things that Luboš and Paul and the researchers mention. I would still argue that if you look at the transparency reports that we've published, specifically for the Google political ads transparency report, when it comes to real life information to users, it is a best-in-class tool that is hard to compare for advertisement in traditional media such as television, such as newspaper. I would say that never a user can really see what ads are out there, how they are being targeted, how much has been spent on them. This data is there. This data is updated. It can be downloaded, and we've seen many researchers working with this data. And this is really a very powerful tool that is very difficult to develop. If you look at elections that ran in 27 member states in parallel, that's something that has been extremely difficult for us to get right. But then again, the other side of the story is this enough? And absolutely fair question from ERGA members is, how can we make sure that what you put in the transparency report is all the political ads that are running there? How can you make sure, and rightly pointed, the issue-based ads for Google Transparency Report are not there. So how do you want to do this? Then we get to the conversation about, is it technically possible? Is it possible from the privacy point of view to just take out a bunch of data and give it to a third party and run it? Some experts on GDPR might say it is fine. Our lawyers are of very different opinion, and here, by the way, we really appreciate the role of the Commission that it can really play a sort of mediator between platforms, researchers, to really say this is possible, this is not, and give us some sort of assurance that providing this type of data would be in line with GDPR. 2 days ago, we spoke with the European Data Protection Officer. They mentioned that they will be publishing some guidelines on what can be provided. So this is really important for us. Also related to what Cornelia mentioned about the patchwork of rules on the EU level and on the member state level. This is something that is really difficult for a global or EU-wide platform to navigate. So again, is this enough, what we are doing? Certainly not. But we also need the guidance, and the code is another way how we can sort of find solutions to that. Which leads me to another topic, which is definitions. And this is yet another area where, if you look at what has been agreed 1 year ago and where we are now, different stakeholders, different actors are looking at different definitions of disinformation, of data, of political ads, of issue-based ads. So it is really hard to find some overarching definitions that would really work for all the different actors. That's why, for instance, us as Google, we are really struggling with the issues-based ads, because if we try to ourselves define what is issues, we will either come up with something very wide or something very narrow, but it's really hard to find the issue. So our sort of way of thinking is to look at transparency for all the ads, which would, by the way, resolve one of the many issues that ERGA has, in terms of really checking whether all the political ads have been labeled. But this is extremely challenging thing to do for company. So that's why unfortunately in most of the monthly reports we always said we are working on this. We're working on this. We really are working on this, and hopefully we'll have something to show soon, because this is the sort of way of travel that would resolve many of our issues. And finally, on the micro targeting, that's one of the things that when we are talking about definitions, Google, and I want to be really clear, Google does not allow micro targeting. We have never allowed micro targeting, or for many years we have not allowed micro targeting for ads general, and specifically for political ads. For political ads, in terms of targeting, we have even stronger rules than for ads overall. Now, when you look at the latest announcement that I've mentioned, we've had different rules for targeting for Europe and for the US. In the US, the tradition has been that you could target based on political leanings. This we have never allowed in Europe. Now, when we've seen the concerns about political ads, right concerns, we've decided to roll this globally. And globally, there is no way now allowed on Google platforms to advertise based on political leanings. You can only advertise on the age, on the geolocation, on gender, and you can have some contextual advertising. But micro-targeting, it is basically, if you take a list of 25 people and you want to target them directly, this is not how our platforms work. You can do it maybe on other platforms, but not on Google. And when we talk about this, every day you see the conversations about why do you allow micro-targeting, and we're coming back to the definitions which are particularly important. And the final remark is the notion of responsibility, and I would argue important is always to realize that this is a shared responsibility for more actors. If you look at political ads, there is always a large portion of responsibility that lies on the advertiser. In many EU member states, you have laws that require advertisers to provide information to authorities. In many member states, you have authorities that can ask political advertiser or a political party or an advertiser, how much have you spent? The transparency report is a good tool for the general public, but then it's really the responsibility for the advertiser to provide this. And I think this really needs to be stressed, and this group should always be brought to the discussion as well, so that we can really work on the really functioning solutions together.
Many thanks, Milan. Anya.
Thank you. So yeah, lots of things, and I don't know how much time do I have, but I will try to go through it all. On advertising in general, we also try to, of course, first and foremost, be very transparent towards our users. So every user can look at any advertisement they see, which is basically right-click on any kind of ad to understand, like, why am I seeing this ad? And the feature is in fact called "Why am I seeing this ad?", which I think is very helpful for our daily use of the platform if you do so. for political advertising and in the context of the elections, we also have put together ad library where basically all the political advertising can be found, can be searched, and can be used for research purposes. We also put an API for journalists and researchers to make it easier. This is, of course, one of the tools, and we heard Erga many times, and we, of course, are taking it into account and trying to find ways forward internally. But for the moment, this ads library is really a rich source of information in terms of what have happened, who paid for what ad, who was basically targeted, and why. And I think, of course, it's not a perfect tool. And we heard also comments related to what we decided to launch as well, the issue ads, that is not always perfect, that we kind of created some kind of framework that doesn't always work. Of course, it never does. This is our first, let's say, steps towards what we will, consider some full kind of overview of information that I know others are waiting for. When it comes to fact-checking, there's a lots of discussions around fact-checking and Facebook. And I think one thing that I want to clarify is that while fact-checking is part of very important, investments we're doing as a company, it's not the only solution. We basically use a variety of tools. Machine learning is very important to kind of make sure that we scale up and we indeed address what Lubos, I think, referred as those simple, easy to spot mistakes, quotation, earth is flat kind of thing, so that our fact checkers will see things on their dashboard that will probably require significant amount of research from their side. This is what we need. From them. We, of course, never telling them what to choose. Maybe we would prefer this or the other. We're not telling them this is the reason for it is that they need to be fully independent from us and work independently as they see fit. We are not covering the whole EU, and that, of course, is an issue as we see it. We decided to work with fact checkers associated in the international network of fact checkers, who basically has a set of very clear criteria for any fact-checking organization to be, first of all, part of this network. And once they're part of this network, each of them is very welcome to come and see whether we can work together. Some countries, however, do not still have a fact-checking partner that is part of that network. But as I say, and I really want to underline this is not the only solution. Fact checking is not going to fix the whole problem, and this is one of the many different tools we're using on the platform to address it. I know there was lots of discussions around what we call coordinated and authentic behavior. Foreign interference, issues around fake accounts. We were providing information about it monthly. You can see it in our reports. We are able to actually block around 1 million of fake accounts from actually coming to the platform. And we also provided in our latest transparency report numbers that also show that we were able to tackle 1.2 billion fake accounts in the last quarter. So these are the numbers that show you the scale of the problem we have to deal with. And of course, that doesn't mean that we removed all the fake accounts. That doesn't mean we flagged all possible false news as disputed content. That doesn't mean that all advertisement in the ad library is included because something perhaps is not there. These tools are still a work in progress. But I think it's great to also recognize that we try and we will continue doing so. I hear about research quite a lot, and we heard those discussions. I think the opinions are varied around data issues, and I'm not the data protection expert, so I will leave it to more experience than me in that space. I just want to clarify that in Europe, we Social Science One, in fact, establish a regional advisory committee, which is led by Amsterdam School of Communication Research, University of Amsterdam. And this advisory committee is kind of in charge of receiving applications, checking the applications, and deciding who will participate in the program. We are independent from that process. We want to keep it that way. Otherwise, it creates indeed confusion that we are maybe choosing friends and people that we know. This is absolutely not the case. I understand that others would like to also receive access. I think this is a very valid request. These are very interesting and important societal challenges that need to be analyzed. However, I do think that the GDPR considerations are still there, and I would do welcome the guidance also from the Commission side, how we can reconcile these and move forward. I think I will stop for the moment.
Okay, time is flying, actually. So, Gianni, your take, listening to these different objections,
simply, simply bullet points from each of you. Paolo, you're perfectly right. Follow the money. It's still the point we should go act and see, because of course that's disinformation, as we were saying, is not like the law of gravity. There are friends studying disinformation, like physicists or computer scientists or logicians, and they have the same attitude to disinformation, like if they were studying, I don't know, the speed of light or gravitation, universal gravitation. And I yell at them, it's like, this is not the case. I mean, we are not studying it, we are fighting it. We are studying in order to fight it. It's like a disease. We study because we want to cure it. So follow the money is for sure very, very important. Lubos, you are right when you say data and monetization. Again, follow the money. Because the problem is that there is a contradiction right now in all the platforms, because of course they have to protect their business model and access to data in a way they feel, rightly so, maybe, that there is some problems, or there could be a problem for privacy for their customers and stuff. This is a regulation problem that we have seen in other industries. For example, pharma, access to data in pharma and ingredients and recipes and formulas. And sometimes they wanted to keep it not exactly transparent, and sometimes the public and the government pushes for more transparency. So the problem is that we have to transform this data versus business model from a contradiction to a dialectic, from something that is yes or no to something that is like, let's discuss about it. The banking. October 2019, so 2 months ago, the Washington Post had counted more than 14,000 false statements by no means than the President of the United States. 14,000 since taking office in January 2017. This has not cost the President a single vote, meaning that the base, the Republican base that voted President Trump in 2016, despite such a prestigious newspaper like the Washington Post, the banking 14,000 official statement of the president, still will vote for him next year. The banking does not work. Yet we have to keep the banking. The banking is like telling your kids, don't go to the disco too much, study, go to the gym, pray, do your homework, don't smoke, don't go eat cigarettes. If you simply, this is the banking, if you simply do that, the kids will do a lot of very bad things. You have to, the bank, what they're trying to do, but then lead by examples. They have to check on them. You have to yell at them. You have to punish them. You have to encourage them. debunking by itself, it's a first step that needs much, much more. Cornelia, you talked about the activism inside the platforms, and I'm a great believer in that, meaning that sometimes they drive me crazy, like Google guys say, we won't work on AI on military issues because then they will bomb kids. In the meantime, in Russia, in China, all the best. But I respect that. I respect it. And I think that if all the benchmarks that we have done, GDPR, the Code of Conduct, the high-level group, open this kind of debates within the platforms, that's healthy. That's healthy, even when they you should work on AI on military issues, even when they drive me crazy. Milan, disinformation is a moving target. That's what is maddening about it, and that's what is interesting about it, and has always been a moving target. Do this as an experiment. 2 more minutes, Paolo, and I'm done. When we discuss about disinformation, we think about these 2 kids in a cellar, spreading disinformation on something. Watch the official Russian TV coverage of something very boring, the 70th anniversary of NATO, North Alliance Treaty Organization. Watch that. I mean, that was very boring. Trump went and behaved. They all read news, speeches, and they congratulate. And Macron had said NATO is brain dead, but nobody actually, mentioned that. I mean, they really were nice guys. On Russian TV, that was like terrible. It was like Spectre. It was like, coming World War III. And still, that was the media diet for millions of people. How do you debunk that? How do you debunk that? And of course, it's interesting for us to follow that. The problem is that, and I want to just pick one point from what Anya said. What I'm saying is very, very, very unpopular these days. If I have 2 American kids, if they would catch me, this is also streaming, but Paolo, can you please censor that? The next 2 minutes, can you black them out? I respect when Zuckerberg says it's difficult for us to decide what is right, what is not wrong, what is true, what is not true. A lot of people thinks that he says that because he's looking at the 3 months budget for Facebook. I think that actually there is a problem there because we European very often are in favor of regulations because we grow up thinking that democracy is for granted, that the rule of law is for granted, and that there is no authoritarianism lurking behind the corner. But now we know, in the past 5 years, we know that authoritarianism is lurking around the corner, and even countries that we thought for never, ever, ever have any kind of problems with democracy are experiencing problems with democracy. So the idea that there should be freedom, I respect that, because we know that today we are in a very democratic situation. Tomorrow we don't know. But what is the problem that we all have, and that, Paolo? The problem is that disinformation spreads because there is a lack of trust. And when you look at why people suck it up and lap it up, disinformation is because they don't trust politicians, political leaders, scientists, teachers, journalists, media, platforms, blah, 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 blah. So the bottom line is how to rebuild trust. And when people come to me like students, like, how do you rebuild trust? I don't want to curse, but, what do I know? I'm a journalist. I mean, I always thought that the problem of trust is like for the Pope, for rabbis, for the Dalai Lama, charismatic political leaders. Honestly, I'm perfectly comfortable of not being trusted. I've always assumed that when I interviewed something like when I was 20 years old, he didn't trust me. And I like that. I like that he didn't trust me. I didn't trust him either. So the rebuilding of trust is something for the new generation of journalists. Very, 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 very important. The platforms should help us in rebuilding of trust. I mean, public TV, it's really, let's not open that with our public TV in my own country, in rebuilding trust.
Excellent, Gianni. I think that it is a perfect moment perhaps to turn to the audience, both here and those who are following us on streaming, to ask questions. Voila.
Do I need a microphone? Thank you. My name is Aliki. I work in DG Communication at the European Commission, tackling disinformation from an awareness-raising perspective and also a debunking perspective, because, as you said, it's still very important to not let societal divisions become bigger than they already are by the spreading of false information. I have a question for Anya. So I was reading this morning an analysis that First Draft did about the political ads that the UK parties have been running ahead of the election, and that 88% of the Tory ads were false or misleading compared to 0% of the Labour ads that were false or misleading. So my question is, because as you said, there's a lot of other things that the Code of Practice enforces, and there's very strong progress that has been shown in other areas like the transparency of ads and the ad libraries, which wouldn't have allowed First Draft and Full Fact to analyze these ads if the libraries weren't in place. But at the same time, how do users have protection against seeing? How do you ensure that users know the truth behind these false statements that they are encountered with, except for the proactive media literacy actions, of course?
I would combine, since this question is particularly directed to you, Anya, there is a second question that seems to be directed to Facebook as well, about, for example, but since the anti-vax disinformation, it is something that Facebook has taken particular into consideration. Perhaps you want to cover both questions. So this question is about what was done to limit disinformation around anti-vax campaigns. What was the approach on Facebook? Your question, anyhow, about the role of debunking and the role of the establishing the truth, I think, goes beyond Anya, who will start perhaps to reply to this question, but it is a broader. It's a broader issue.
Yeah, just to add something, the question is directed to Anya because the false ads were identified on Facebook, but also were not labeled as
so
false,
the question
because
is whether
they are
political
political
ads is a legitimate thing or not.
Oh, you want
Thank you. So I start with the question, and I think there was a lot of indeed discussions around our approach to this issue. We generally don't fact check political ads. That's part of our policy. We don't think we are in place as a private company to do that towards politicians, who should be judged by their electorate, broadly speaking. So in cases they are saying something, the politicians, I mean, that was previously debunked by a fact checker, of course, that will still apply, and that will be demoted in the newsfeed of any of us. However, we are not fact checking the political advertising. So this is quite clear policy we decided to take, and there was indeed a lot of discussions whether this is the right approach or not. Some companies decided to go very different route. We decided to go that route, and I'm sure there are lots of valid reasons for explaining each of them. This is our approach. That's how we feel as a company. on misinformation around vaccination. So we had a lot of discussions with experts how to approach this very particular part of misinformation, which is related to people discussing vaccination in a very in a way that basically encourages people to stop the vaccination altogether. And of course, that leads to a real world harm. And we, in that sense, decided that we need to specifically address this problem and partner, in fact, with WHO and basically work in that they basically, so we understood also from our experience with working with fact checkers and many other people on these issues that oftentimes people just don't like to be told what is right. They will believe what they want to believe because this is mainstream, perhaps trying to trick them. So we decided with a partnership, for example, with WHO to just inform them this is disputed, and immediately link informed piece of content from WHO. And now we partner with other organizations in that space so that they can read it for themselves, so that they have immediate and immediate basically access to the information. But we will not say, oh, you have to vaccinate your children or you have to vaccinate yourself. Simply because, again, it's not our role as a private company, but also because through, those conversations, we realized that actually this is very counterproductive.
On the more general question, I would like to say two words, because on the one side, okay.
I just wanted to say that you need to turn off.
It works. Normally it works. On the more general question, and listening to what Gianni has just said regarding the effectiveness of debunking not being the solution, but at the same time, listening from the grounds of an institution that it is often attacked with falsehoods and myths, right? They are working on the grounds in the first line, and their work, it's a daily fight that you carry out not only alone, but with the delegations, with the representations in the member states. And indeed, it is important that people get the policies that we are doing right. That is beyond doubt. The question perhaps to ask ourselves, what is the purpose of debunking on social media platforms, bearing in mind that people do not like to be told what is right and what is wrong, and to like to make their own mind by themselves. My view is that we should we should start to think about fact-checking as one component of a more complex process. The process should focus more on the type of manipulations, therefore behaviors that take place on digital media that harness the vulnerabilities of these specific services, and use the fact-checking, the fact checks as leads, as indicators, as guiding lines in order to better focus investigations of behavior, malicious behavior, that takes place on the platforms themselves. So indeed, I would shift the focus from the content to the conduct, but taking the analysis of the content as a way to filter out the type of investigations that need, and therefore research, that needs to be undertaken in order to better understand the trends of disinformation and the threats as they evolve over time. That is, I think, the way to look at fact-checking, but happy to hear other point of views.
If I may, just to add to the discussion about debunking and the fact checking of the political advertising, I wouldn't say whether this is right or wrong, the approach that the Facebook has taken. But the thing is that when we have those ad archives, it is possible at least to look at that, and if there are people who can do that from outside, so at least there is a mean which is good that we have it in a code of practice to actually do that. Of course, then you don't get the benefits of the actual tools that are being implied by the Facebook on its platform. But again, at least that there's we begin to have the transparency in the form of the ad archives can be extremely useful.
unless there are questions from here, from the room, I can see there are a number of questions coming from external viewers. We need to promote our disinformation busting big time. Can we have the resources? Well, yes, we would like to have the resources indeed. But the question is perhaps resources for what? Where the resources should be better employed, in particular by public authorities, be it at the EU level or national level. Do you have any view about it?
Very, very briefly, when we were in the high-level group, I always mentioned that Europe is investing money in agriculture, the fishing industry, supporting theaters, schools, the movie industry. And why don't we invest some money into the professional journalists working on disinformation? It was a very, very, very unpopular view. Maybe Alberto remembers it. And the staunchest enemies were the Association of Journalists, pretty much asking, you want the state, the politician to give us money? I said, yes, all the way. And it was very unpopular. But I think that we should look at that, meaning scholarship, fellowship, not simply to study, to enforce for e-literacy, for e-education.
If I may add to that, I completely agree, because the part of the problem, of course, is the crumbling, the media environment that we currently have. And the problem with disinformation is that prevalent, for example, not only because of the lack of trust, but also the changing structure of the media environment. Because before, it seemed that democracy is ensured just because, it is here and everybody is happy. But the big part of that was the what we now call mainstream media, that were editorially controlled, and not every kind of information and every kind of opinion got through that. And there was very strong, so to say, liberal bias, which disappeared because of the entering of the social media. And I'm not saying that is bad. It is like it is. But now, if we again want to have back the positive effect of that old media environment, we need to rebuild the old type of media with editorial control and professionalism. And how do you do that without money? And I know that the platforms are investing into these kind of things, but again, it probably, in the terms of trust, is not useful if it's only the business money.
Well, 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, I was with the Canadians for a EU-Canadian dialogue in Ottawa on disinformation and on diversity. Well, what they are envisaging, actually doing, it is to create a fund to support journalism, a fund with around 150 million Canadian dollars per year. And their point of departure is it's a fund that is going to be managed external to the external to the government. They will have their own selection methods which are completely independent from any influence by the government. The government will simply convey support, financial support, and then the distribution methods and the approaches has to be decided in a completely independent manner. The interesting thing is that they look very much at the impact on employment. Journalism, it is particularly eroded in the local journalism in Canada. A report published last week with the authorship of Madeleine de Kock-Burning and Rasmus Nielsen points to another weakness in Europe. It is not only local journalism, but also foreign news that are affected. So the cost of foreign correspondence, it is high. And that determines that the cut in employment in the journalistic profession happens particularly there in these sectors. Now, it's very dramatic because local journalism is what drives people to keep reading newspapers or watching news. Foreign news, it what's keep mind open and beyond national boundaries, and therefore is an antidote against nationalistic narratives. If both are cut off, if there are loss of jobs in both fronts, we have people that with less propensity to read and view, and those who read and view will be shaped into nationalistic narratives, which is the worst of the possible world. There are 28,000 jobs which have been lost in the journalistic profession since 2015 up to now. I think the situation is sufficiently dramatic, I think, to agree with the suggestion in the question that it's time to think about how to channel resources, not only EU resources, but also member state resources to support journalism.
And absolutely, and also the company's resources and promoting quality journalism is something that we are very much looking into. We have a special branch, Google News Initiative, that is working specifically on that. Just from the beginning of this year, we trained 4,000 journalists. Why I'm saying this is that what we are doing is we are focusing on things that we know the best. So one of the ways, one of the focus of the trainings is to really help, for instance, the journalists themselves how to fact check, how to better work with the information online. One of very simple fact checking tool that our trainers are focusing on is image search, and how to work with images to detect disinformation, because very often images are being used in different contexts, different scenarios, and it's a very, very simple tool how people can go to metadata of images and find out that there is some sort of disinformation. Then, of course, there is the second side of the story, which is the media literacy. It might sound like a sort of soft tool, but it is extremely important one in the long run, and something where, again, we are looking for partnerships with governments, with NGOs, trying not to really recreate a wheel. I think that's a very important part of the efforts, and really look into what is happening locally and moving on. We really want to and one of the learnings from the code of practice is we really need to double down on rolling out those things across the EU. When we're speaking about the code of practice, not to do it in one or two markets, but really when we are doing something, do it in all the EU member states, because there needs to be sort of a common line, and again, working with the Commission and working with Europe Schoolnet and others on finding the partners that are doing this locally is something that has proved to be extremely valuable for us.
The time is flying. It is almost 2 hours we have been here. I would say let's allow another couple of questions before closing, with the invitation to be concise in the replies. The first question here, it is interesting actually. Anya, I think it is again for you to tell us something. It is the forwarding limits on WhatsApp. Is it a good approach to fight disinformation on WhatsApp? Are you planning new measures to fight disinformation on WhatsApp? Do you have some elements of reply for this question?
Yes, thank you. Very good question. Indeed, we often talk about Facebook, but we of course deploy various measures also on our family of apps, WhatsApp being a very important part of it. So basically, the limit of forwarding is quite important feature, because it kind of blocks from mass forwarding that we observed in certain elections in certain member states, or actually outside of Europe first, and then in one of the member states. And this helped us to kind of tailor this base that, of course, sometimes among friends we want to immediately forward each other some messages, but there has to be certain limit based on what is the reasonable number of friends we actually might have, rather than rather than thousands, millions of people that we might want to target with that message. So we think this is working. We of course will not just finish there. We have a couple of other announcements that are coming and are in the pipeline, so I probably cannot speak about them here today, especially this is web stream. But yeah, this is one of the methods. We of course I think everyone knows WhatsApp is a very different service than other applications. In a sense, it's end-to-end encrypted, so it's very privacy focused. But there are certain ways we can, of course, make sure we can address this spread of misinformation. Forwarding limit is one of them.
Lubos, you want to add something?
Yes, very quickly, because
I think this is the best example, or a very good example, of how you can introduce a kind of friction into this frictionless environment, which is basically, you know, why the virality is so prevalent on that. So and this also focuses us on the role of design of the platforms and the interfaces, you know, how you are dealing with the platforms, because this is something that not many people are concerned about, but it is extremely important how you design what the user can do on the platform that actually then defines what actually the platform is doing to the whole society. So I think this is a very good example of that.
Very good. Perhaps the last question, I leave the floor to you. You have the mic already, Lubos. It is, what are the news on the ERGA report? When is the publication expected?
It's very easy, Paolo. We will send it to you in the first half of January. That's what we agreed at the last plenary yesterday. And if I may very shortly, we are also planning, of course, continuing the work on disinformation. So throughout the next year, we'll be focusing on various aspects, collaboration with the Commission. But one important part, I think, will be, and it's already been mentioned by Milan and Cornelia, that the lack of the unity in definitions across the EU, for example, a lack of harmonization in the legal framework around this. And we'll be focusing on that because, as we understand, there is no comprehensive report or study on what are the different definitions and approaches in different member states. So we will try to take stock on that and try to help to give more transparency on this, and probably it will help us in the debate further.
Very good. Many thanks. I think it's time to close. Thanks to the participants and thanks to the panelists for your intervention today. Thank you.